Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking time out of your busy day to come here and listen to somebody like me. It's very much appreciated. Before I start, I'd just like to give you a little bit of history, and in doing so, I'd like to thank Boyd Trites for inviting me to speak here today. Many of you may not know that I grew up in Kennebecasis Park, spent my formative years there, and our next door neighbor was the Trites family. And while I was growing up as an only child, Boyd and his lovely wife Fern together raised 5 wonderful children. But during that time in K Park growing up, I never thought he really liked me very much, and I could never figure out why. And then I was thinking it through, and then I said, yeah, you know, if you go to practice golf on your front lawn and bang a couple of golf balls off his car parked in the driveway next to you, that's probably not going to endear him to you very much. And then I said, but that can't be it, because he doesn't know about that. So I had to think of something else. So let's let that be our little secret. If you're talking to Boyd, don't mention the golf ball thing, because I don't want him to know. Anyway, I'd like to tell you a little story. And in telling you the story, I'm going to ask you to remember 5 names, because they're a crew of 5 sergeants that started out together in August of 1942, formed a crew, started to fly Wellingtons over Germany. I'll start, give you the names, and then give you a little bit of a history about them. The pilot was Paddy Coughlin from Cork in Ireland. That's at the front of the plane. In the middle of the plane, you had 3 Scots. Willie McLaughlin was the bomb aimer. Peter Murdoch was the wireless operator. And Jimmy Clark was the navigator. 5 people, not like a Halifax where there's a crew of 6. This is a crew of 5. And finally, stuck in the back of the plane, you may have known him, Warren Ellis, all alone way back there. A little bit about their history. Paddy Coughlin came from Cork in Ireland. Paddy hated Englishmen. Paddy could outfight any man outside a tavern. He could outdrink any man inside a tavern. Every second word he said was a swear word, and in fact he had a favorite word that he used as an adjective, an adverb, a noun, and a pronoun. He hated authority, and in my father's eyes, he was the best pilot in the Royal Air Force. Jimmy Clark was from Scotland. He was the navigator. He was 5 foot 7 inches tall, and he was devilishly handsome. Over here, I have a photo, the farthest one to the right, is a photo of the crew. And I'd like to ask all the ladies at the end of today, if you come up here. This is Jimmy, right here. The picture doesn't do him justice, but he was dashingly handsome. Just for illustration, that's Dad, that's Paddy. You can tell by the broad shoulders and the stance that he's ready for anything. This is Willie the bomb aimer, and that's Peter the wireless operator. Dad found that when they went drinking together as a crew in Kermington, which is close to where they were stationed, they found a little tavern called the Marrowbone and Cleaver, and actually I've been there. When Dad took me out of school for 3 weeks when I was 11 years old, we visited the Marrowbone and Cleaver, and Dad had to drink there. I didn't, because I was 11. I had to wait a year. And the Marrowbone and Cleaver was your basic tavern, in that there was no such thing as a urinal for the men. You went out back. There was a wall. It was grated. That was how basic the Marrowbone and Cleaver was. Dad found something out, though. If he went there and sat by himself, no girls approached him. If he went with Jimmy and sat with Jimmy, 8 or 9 girls would approach them. Jimmy loved the ladies, and the ladies loved Jimmy, and he was a fantastic navigator. Peter Murdoch, the wireless operator, would introduce himself as Peter Murdoch, Murdoch with an H. He could not stand misspelling, where he was Murdoch with a K, it was Murdoch with an H. That's the way he introduced himself. He was the oldest of the crew. He was old, 29 years old. And he and his wife Rose had 2 young daughters at home. And it makes you think, why is this person with a family at home risking their life flying over Germany? The crew was allowed to go to the armory before every mission. And if they wanted to, they could take out a sidearm in case they were shot down. And Peter was the only one that would sign out a .38. And Peter's logic was, if we get shot down over Germany, I have this. The first 5 are for them. The last one is for me. I'm dead, and Rose gets a full pension. That was how Peter looked at life. Willie McLaughlin was the bomb aimer. he was also from Scotland. He had a famous battle cry that he let loose on every single mission, because every single mission they dropped their bomb load. All the crew were connected by radio. You could hear what everybody said. And so Dad would be in the tail turret, and I would hear, steady, Patty, steady, Patty. Hold it, Patty, coming up on target. And this is while shells are exploding around you. The aircraft is heaving. There's night fighters firing at you because they know you're close to your target. Steady, Patty, steady, Patty. Hold it. Bomb's gone. Let's get the heck out of here. He didn't say heck. But what he did say was exactly the word that you have thought of that he probably said in place of heck. And the good news is that he did have a chance to yell that 30 times. He and Dad and Peter roomed together in a little Nissen hut, and Willie played the chanter, which I came to understand is the top part of bagpipes designed to give the melody, except when he played there was no melody. So Dad had a few jokes. He would say, Willie, what's the difference between a trampoline and a chanter? And Willie would say, I don't know. And Dad would say, you take your shoes off when you jump on a trampoline. He was a great bomb aimer. He was a poor chanter player. And I'm glad it's like that, because if it was the other way around, it wouldn't have been good for the crew. And finally, in the back of the plane, the Canadian, Warren Ellis, as they said, the tail gunner, had the best seat in the house, for good or for bad. And when Dad finished his pilot training in Stanley, and there's a photograph there of the entire crew, what he found was he wasn't a very good pilot. And he also found that there wasn't very much of a demand for pilots over in the European theater unless you wanted to serve as a pilot in Coastal Command. What he did find out was that there was a tremendous demand for tail gunners. He didn't initially know why. Why was because they were getting shot out of the turrets bombing Germany. In some cases, sprayed out with a hose at the end of the mission. So Dad enlisted in a tail gunnery course. There were 48 who graduated. Dad graduated in the top 12. They segmented them from lowest to highest. And actually, he had the two highest marks in two categories, skeet shooting being one. My father did have very good hand-eye coordination, which was not passed down to me. And second, the disassembly and assembly of the tail guns in the dark. He was very good at those. So when he went over as one of 48 air gunners to have training over in Europe, he was one of the top 12. And he was one of the 3 of the top 12 to come back alive from over flying Germany. So there you have it. And this was painted on the side of the airplane because you did have an Irishman pilot, you had 3 Scots in the middle of the plane, and you had Dad at the back. So the emblem on the side of their Wellington was a shamrock, 3 thistles in the middle, and a little maple leaf at the very end. And then they went off to war. But before I explain that, I need to put in the proper perspective what was happening from August of 1942 when they became a crew together, and August of 1943 when they were disbanded after completing their tour. That time, arguably, was the worst time during World War II to bomb the Ruhr River Valley, which was the industrial heartland of Germany. Events in 1942 had caused Germany to shift from an offensive position to a defensive position, and primarily this was because Bomber Harris had put lots of bombers in the air, and big cities, industrial cities, Essen, Cologne, Dortmund, they were being bombed heavily. So Germany decided to invest heavily in protecting these cities. They put rings of steel around them, thousands of searchlights around all these cities, hundreds and hundreds of 88 millimeter guns, thousands of night fighters all protecting these cities. And that's what this little crew of 5 flew into. If you look at the statistics for Bomber Command, and sometimes they differ a little bit, but the message is there. This is what folks need to know. For every man who flew with Bomber Command, and multiply that by 100, so let's say for every 100 men who flew with Bomber Command, 56 were killed in the air or died of their injuries. Up until late 1944, when the Luftwaffe wasn't as prevalent in the air, this percentage was actually higher. Greater than 56 out of 100 were killed before they could finish a tour and leave the war. 12 out of every 100 ended up a prisoner of war. 14 out of every 100 survived being shot down. Only 27%, or 27 out of 100, whoever enlisted in Bomber Command left the war unscathed. 73% either died, suffered because of their injuries, or persevered with pain in some manner or another. September 3rd, 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, if you were enlisted in Bomber Command then, your chances of being alive on May 8th, 1945 were 1 in 10. A 10% chance of surviving the war in Bomber Command. Overall, 55,573 airmen were killed in action. Their average age, folks, was 22. On a single night, Bomber Command lost more aircraft than Fighter Command did during the entire Battle of Britain. In total, and this is a staggering number, Bomber Command lost 8,325 aircraft. It is a slaughter that is paralleled only by select battles of World War I. In fact, there's a great article in today's paper regarding that, and the casualties suffered by the U-boat crews late in World War II. Is it any wonder that the nickname for the meal that you had, the pre-mission meal you had before taking on an operation, was called the Last Supper? So they started. They started as a crew, and their target was the Ruhr River Valley, and they flew into hell every night. And then Dad started to realize something. No matter how bad the flak was, no matter how many night fighters were out there searching after them, Paddy will never turn back. He will do whatever it takes to deliver the load of bombs, and no matter how damaged they are, he will always get them back to Kermington in England. Paddy will always do that. And his dad thought he's the best pilot in the Royal Air Force. I'd like to take a second right now, because this is the environment that they're flying into, and pass a few things around to you. This, because when you hear the word flak, you may say, well, what the heck does that mean? It sounds like this on this table. It's this heavy. This is what actually does explode outside of the aircraft when a shell explodes. This is what comes flying into your tail turret, rips right through your glove, and can actually cut your hand open. It can also kill you. And you can have hundreds of these come into your aircraft flying over Cologne, flying over Essen. The only thing I would ask is I'd like to get this back. It is kind of a family heirloom, but if you'd like to pass that around, that would be very much appreciated. These I can't hand around because these actually have not been fired. So maybe by law I'm not supposed to have these here. And I would be very remiss if I just kind of tossed it into the audience. I don't think anybody would like that. But this is important because what you're looking at here is a gun clip from a 303 Browning gun in the tail turret. And what you see here is what happens when one of those comes in while you're firing at a night fighter, and it hits your gun belt and it jams your guns, which is not a lot of fun when you're in the middle of a fight. So I'll leave these here if you'd like to look at it at the end. This is a copper line. It comes from a tail turret. Tail turrets are hydraulically run, so you can move automatically from side to side. Thank heavens that when a piece of shrapnel comes in and cuts your hydraulic line, that there is a little hand crank that you can turn to move your turret from side to side. It's not a lot of fun when this happens when you have a night fighter staring down. And I'd like to pass this around as well. When you talk about a tail gunner and their life, this is the real thing. This is a photograph of a Fraser-Nash 4A tail turret of a Wellington Mark III. This is my father's life right here for his tour and second tours. And if you want to have a look at that, that may give you, and pass that around, that may give you a little bit of an idea as to the environment that you're living in. But every single mission, despite the flak and despite the night fighters, Paddy would say, hang on boys, we're going in. So imagine the worst flight you've ever been on in your life, and then start having holes shot in your plane by flak, bullets flying into your plane, and the aircraft heaving all over the sky, your port engine catching on fire and going out. That was the hell that they flew into. The night over Hamburg, their fifth mission, proved very instructive. Again, Hamburg was very well defended, and they were shot up pretty bad. The aircraft was heaving, shrapnel was coming in, tearing into the aircraft. Of course, Paddy didn't turn around. He said, hang on, boys, we're going in. They flew in at 17,000 feet. The port wing took 3 terrible, terrible hits, shut the engine down. Patty managed to drop the bomb load, get them back to Kermington, and what they found out when they returned is of the aircraft in 166 Squadron that flew over Hamburg, theirs was the only one that completed its mission. The only one that flew through all that, dropped their bombs, and then made it back in a severely damaged aircraft. And then they looked a little bit above the squadron level. They went to the group level, they went to the flight level, and they found that they stopped at 72 aircraft that turned back over Hamburg. 1 out of 72, their little crew, was the only one that made it over Hamburg, bombed, and turned back. The entire Alouette squadron turned back that night because of the flak. This little crew of 5 sergeants was the only one that carried out the duty that they were assigned. And back at base, they had operational boards. And the pilots were listed in order of whoever could carry out the most missions successfully. So it was pretty close, 5 missions into the tour. But then all of a sudden, Paddy Coughlin's crew had that perfect record. So their name was at the top. And they assigned little letters to each operation that you had so that they knew how you did. The best 3 letters to have were DCO after your flight. That stood for duty carried out. It meant you went over, you dropped your bombs, and you came back alive. AS stood for aborted sortie, which meant that you could turn back if the pilot's discretion said, this is crazy, I'm not putting the life of my crew in danger, or you had mechanical problems, and that's an unwritten story. There were many, many mechanical problems, many mechanical reasons that caused bombers to turn around and head back home. And of course, you didn't want to see MIA, because that meant you either were down and you were confirmed dead because another bomber saw the crew go down, or you didn't know whether you landed and you were still alive. But that night, after the 5th mission, Paddy Coughlin's air crew became the #1 crew in 166 Squadron, and the #1 crew within the group and the #1 crew within the flight. Paddy Coughlin's crew, duty carried out. They carried on at further operations. They were shot up every night, hundreds of holes in the aircraft. They fought it out. They landed with 1 engine shot out. Paddy got them back. One of their 3 crashes was because one of their engines was shot out. Paddy got them back. He got them over to the English side. The tail gunner's job was to be the eyes in the back of the head of the pilot. It isn't so much shooting at the ME-109s and ME-110s and Junkers 88s that come at you. It's also being able to track the path of the flak, to be able to tell your pilot to take evasive action. It's also to be able to track the fighters and their movements so you know when one's going to come up underneath you or how they're going to attack you. So all of a sudden, Paddy would hear, "Start weaving, Paddy." And Paddy knew exactly what that meant. One night, over Stuttgart, an amazing thing happened. 7 seconds after the bombs were dropped, a shell from an 88mm gun came up through the bomb bay, went through Jimmy's navigation table, ricocheted out the port side of the bomber, and exploded. And all Dad remembered was the plane shuddering like this, almost going sideways, as if it had been blown and buffeted. He heard Peter yell, "I'm hit." And he immediately decided to get out of the tail turret because there were no night fighters around them at the time, went through the little doors that could get back into the main fuselage. Jimmy had grabbed a fire extinguisher because an electrical fire had started, and Jimmy was trying to put the fire out. They lost their instrumentation. They lost their hydraulics. Dad looked to the right. The parachute for the tail gunner was not in the tail turret. You had to come out of the tail turret and go partway down the fuselage, and there it was. Dad's parachute was on fire. Somehow, a miracle, Paddy got the bomber back to Kermington and landed it. And when the air crew on the ground saw it, they were shocked. Long story short, that bomber was junked. It was torn to shreds. There wasn't a wire in it that they could use. They could not believe that Paddy Coughlin could fly that back from over Germany. The port engine had shut down because of the explosion. No power other than the gas going through to make the other engine work. Truly a miracle. And yet 4 days later, they were laughing about it in the Marrowbone and Cleaver. And they were laughing hysterically about it because when you think about it, there's 2 things you don't know about that story. The first thing you don't know is that Jimmy did put the fire out with the fire extinguisher and used only about a quarter of the capacity of the fire extinguisher to do it. After he did, he couldn't turn it off. So with no fire, 3/4 of the capacity of the fire extinguisher was going off. The second thing you don't know is Peter was hit and he was wounded. But the shrapnel from the shell exploding came in, hit the bottom floor of the aircraft, shot up through the seat that Peter sat on as wireless operator, and lodged in his bum. And he did have to have it removed. But then they're sitting around 4 days later having a few bitters in the Marrowbone and Cleaver, and it becomes hysterical because here's Dad leaving the tail turret, going back into the plane. The plane is heaving, so no one has their balance, and all he sees is Jimmy walking around like this with a fire extinguisher and spraying everywhere inside the airplane. Peter's on the ground like this, holding his bum, and Dad looks at his parachute and it's on fire. What could be funnier than that? And they laughed at it. And it's amazing because they all should have died. And it was a miracle they were alive, and 4 days later, they're laughing about it. And they're telling that story for years. And I always figured that it took them 4 bombers to finish their tour. That's based on the logic of being shot down and crashing 3 times. This wasn't recognized as a crash because Patty landed it. But technically, this crew finished their first tour on their 5th bomber because this one was junked. So future missions involve going up the Elbe River because you were the best in the crew or the best in the squadron. And you had to find 21 exact navigational drop points to drop little mines, executed all 21 perfectly. Great navigation, great flying, great defense, perfectly executed. The best crew in the squadron, the best at the best. What was sad was going to the Marrowbone and Cleaver and then all of a sudden asking, well, where's Bill Smith? We had a great time with him last night. Well, Bill went down last night. His bomber exploded. He's gone. And then there's superstition. W for William in 166 Squadron never finished a tour. Every crew that landed W for William was shot down and perished. Could not finish a tour. Dad's journal, when you read it, identifies some very shocking facts. Here's a quote. 598 bombers went out last night. 55 didn't come back. Maybe we shouldn't be sent out in the bright moonlight. I have to read this because it is important. The tours, as it got to its conclusion, the operations racked up, one city after another. Dusseldorf, Dortmund, Frankfurt, Witten, Riehen, Dorsten, Gladbeck, Essen, 3 times Essen, Chemnitz, Duisburg, Bochum, Stuttgart, as I mentioned, Van Eyckel, Munster, Hanauer, Castrop-Rauxel, Wuppertal, Mannheim, Bonn, Mainz, Hamburg, 3 times, Weissel, Worms, Cologne, 3 times. All duty carried out, no matter how bad the flak was, no matter how bad the night fighters were. Patty never turned back. They dropped their bombs and they came home safely. And I had mentioned this 6 months ago. I'm sure it's a known fact now, but after World War II, folks would say, notice that the cathedral in Cologne, built in the year 1248, while the rest of the city was devastated, the Cologne cathedral is still standing. And maybe it's because of divine intervention, or maybe it's because the RAF bombers were not as good as they thought they were. That's not true. The reason why the Cologne Cathedral stood was because they didn't want to bomb it. In fact, it was explicitly stated, don't bomb it, because it was the greatest navigational landmark they could ever find. The second that they saw the cathedral, they could almost tell you to the foot how far to go to the various chemical plants that were around Cologne. The cathedral was bombed 14 times, every time by accident. They didn't want to bomb it. They wanted it there because they knew where to go when they got there. And when they were bombing, Dad would notice, because this was a key part of being the tail gunner, that as the shells from an 88 millimeter gun started to get closer to you, because they were very good on the ground, they had your speed, they had your altitude, you had the searchlights on you, and it was only a matter of time before they could calculate it so that the stream of shells was going to hit your bomber. And so that was always tense for Dad. It's that minute between Willie trying to get Patty to level out to be able to drop at the right site, and then Dad seeing the explosions starting to come closer to the bomber. Do you call evasive action and break off the exact drop? Or do you hope that you understand the pattern enough to be able to not say it and still get away safe? And there were many times, once a bomb load was dropped, the bomber would go straight up in the air. Dad thought that was a lot of fun. It's just everything goes up into your throat. And there were more than a few times during their tour where, when the bomber went up, within a few seconds, Dad saw a shell explode below exactly where the bomber would have been if it had not have dropped its bomb load. One night over Essen, the worst thing that Dad said actually happened to him in the entire war happened. They were coned. That's when 2 or more searchlights get on you. And he went absolutely blind. He said it was like being in a white room where you literally can't see anything. And he, like all of us, he'd been snowblind driving a car. We all know what that's like, where you just can't see anything. Dad said this was far worse. He could not see a thing. And once you're coned, the night fighters know you're there and they jump in. So all he could say very quickly was, "Patty, I'm blind, evasive action now." And they hadn't dropped the bombs. And Patty, with a full bomb load, dropped the bomber in a death spiral, brought it up to normal height. And so the coning threat was stopped. And all Dad remembers is he was blind 1 second, and then he was just looking straight up in the sky because Patty dropped the bomber straight down. The best pilot in the Royal Air Force, as far as Dad was concerned. Over Bochum, Dad wasted almost all his ammo trying to keep an Me-110 off, and that night he saw 5 bombers shot down by a group of Me-110s. Over Dusseldorf, he figured out that the Me-109, which is not really considered a night fighter, but it was an Me-109, how they would go into a dive because they wanted to do a belly attack on you. What they really wanted to do was to get you from underneath before you drop your bombs. But you could figure out their pattern and let them go into the dive, and when they started to come up, you would know exactly how to communicate to the pilot the evasive action to take, because the pilot didn't see it coming. If the tail gunner didn't see it, it was very, very bad. So this is one of the things that bothered Dad the most after the war. He saw bombers explode in midair. What was beside him 1 minute was not there the next minute. He saw bombers coned, and he didn't see any evasive action taken by the pilot, and he couldn't figure out why. He didn't know whether the tail gunner was already dead, whether the tail gunner was asleep, which happened because of the long trips that they used to take, or just didn't know or panicked. And then he would see the fighters come in and he would see them focus on the tail turret, and then he would see the tail turret disintegrate. And then he would see the fighter go after the rest of the bomber, and he would see the bomber go down. It bothered him for the rest of his life. He asked, why does that have to happen? Why do I see this right beside me? But then one of the things that he always knew, as I mentioned, is Patty is always going to complete his mission. No matter how bad they're shot up, Patty is always going to get him back. He's the best pilot in the Royal Air Force. And up around 20 operations, 20 on the way to 30, Dad was very proud to say simply, "I am Patty Coughlin's tail gunner." So when you're the best crew in the squadron, the best crew in the flight, the best crew in the group, you get special operations. So one such special operation was the U-boat pens at Lorient. Now, if you look at Germany's position strategically after they invaded France, this made a lot of sense to have the U-boats based in Saint-Nazaire and Lorient, because prior to that, Germany is essentially landlocked, and to have anything leave, you have to go through the north, you have to navigate, and it's difficult to get out into the North Atlantic. If your strategy is to choke off Britain, starve them, and you look at the map of Western France, this is the place for you to put your U-boats. The Bay of Biscay, the easiest access to the North Atlantic you could ever have. So they doubled down on protecting these U-boats, and they would eventually, through the war, spend a lot of time and concrete building these almost impregnable pens for them. They were called K1, K2, and K3. Some of them may still stand to this day. So the best crews were the ones that were assigned to go deep into the harbor and drop the bombs on these pens to see if you could shut them down. It meant coming in at 300 feet. It also meant that if you were hit, your bomber exploded immediately, because like everything else there, it was protected with searchlight batteries. At that time, the Wellington bomber was refitted so that it could carry a 4,000-pound bomb, and Dad didn't know of a bigger bomb at that time. And he had the best seat in the house. because, as they would come to expect, Patty flew brilliantly, the wireless was good, Jimmy navigated perfectly, they got over the target, Willie got him there, they dropped this big 4,000-pound bomb, and it hit exactly in the middle of two of the pens, and it exploded. Better than expected results, and then the fire spread to the buildings on the dock. Tactically, this was brilliant. Duty carried out. Strategically, it was good as well, because concrete's a fixed resource, and Hitler diverted a lot of concrete that was supposed to go to the building of the Atlantic Wall down to Lorient to reinforce the U-boat pens. So who knows how many lives this plucky little group of Bomber Command folks saved by frustrating the U-boat progress at Lorient. A fixed resource used at Lorient may have saved lives on D-Day. You also get specific jobs. For example, it's called gardening, a little mine laying in the Kattegat and the Skagerrak. That's just off the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark. This is specific mine laying. You have to have the best crews doing it. And it's not a large group of bombers that go out. In this case, it was 3 bombers that went out. It was the best crew in 166 Squadron, guess who, and the best crews in 2 other squadrons who went out. They had mines. The Navy can't get to these places. It has to be the Air Force if you're going to mine it. And again, it was protected with searchlight batteries and flak batteries. And they were flying in, and all 3 were together, and then they were picked up by a searchlight battery, and it started firing on all 3 planes. Again, they were used to this. It started coming in the side of the plane. Something interesting happened. One of the bullets found its way into the cockpit, and Dad's words are, and I've read the writing too, he didn't say cut. He said it hit Patty in the mouth, and it creased, it cut his lip, and it went right up, the bullet went right up here, right up to his ear. Now, if you look at that picture of Patty standing there to the right, do not make him angry. And they did. And so very calmly, Dad heard a voice from the cockpit, and the voice said, "Warren, do you want to have a go at them?" So Dad stupidly said, "Well, I don't think that's part of the mission, is it?" And Patty said, "That's not what I asked you. What I asked you was, do you want to have a go at them?" And Dad said, "Yes, absolutely." Now, Dad's Browning guns, if you're around 600 yards away, they're not very effective. And if you're trying to keep a fighter off, usually the most you can do is puck, 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 puck like this to make them think that you're awake and don't come in any closer. You really can't take anything down like Buzz Burling could from 600 yards away. It's more of a defensive measure. However, you get within 300 yards, and you've seen the picture of the tail turret, you've seen those 4 guns. You get within 300 yards of something and open fire on it, it is devastating. So right in the middle of the mission, Patty turned the bomber around and came back with the searchlight battery and the flak battery right there, came on, he cut hard to the left, Dad swung hard to the right, and as he was passing by, Dad unloaded everything. And searchlights went flying, flak batteries went flying, devastation. There was no shooting back. And Dad always had the greatest of respect for the German fighter, and so when there was no fire back, he knew exactly what had happened. They finished the mission, they laid the mines exactly where they were supposed to, and they came back to base. When they did, Dad had a little bit of ammunition left in one of his 4 guns. All of it had been used in destroying the flak tower and the searchlight tower. Jimmy was perfect. Peter was perfect. Willie was perfect. Patty was perfect. Another duty carried out. The bad news was the 2 bombers that went with them, the best of their respective squadrons, they were shot down by that battery. They did not make it back. Further operations involved Saint-Nazaire. They had to release parachute bombs and drop. Perfect. Duty carried out. The best of the best. The missions continued on February 3rd, 1943. Patty radioed back to the gang, "I just want you folks to know that it's minus 43 degrees Fahrenheit out there." And at that same time, Dad was entertaining a Junkers 88 that was on his tail. And as I mentioned before, normally you kind of shoot at them to keep them off so they know you're there. And Dad didn't do that night. He said he was feeling good after the searchlight bit. And he said, "I'm going to let this fella come in close. And if I can get him in close enough, maybe I can take him out." So he got in closer and closer and closer. And then Dad said, "This is close enough." Pulled on the guns, and the whole blocks just fell forward and nothing happened. Minus 43 degrees, there was hoarfrost all over the guns. His guns had seized. He could not fire. And so for 2 seconds, here you are. You have not warned your pilot that there is a Junkers 88 that is sitting right out there now, and he's looking at you and he knows that you can't fire because you would have fired by now. And that's not a good 2 seconds to be in, because it's not just your life that's at stake, it's the life of your crew. 1001, 1002, 1003, and the Junkers 88 peels away. And the only thing Dad could figure out, it wasn't because he felt sorry for him. It had to be at minus 43 that night in February that the guns of the Junkers 88 had frozen as well. And that was the only reason why he was still alive. And Dad had great reason to be afraid of the number 88. It was the 88 millimeter gun, the anti-aircraft gun that was shooting at them from the ground in the Ruhr River Valley. And when Dad found out that they were going to put one on the Tiger tank, he was shocked. He said, this is just going to devastate anything. There won't be a tank that can even compete with this. And then the Junkers 88, which the Germans called the maid of all work. And the reason they did was because it was a fighter, it was a bomber, it was a night fighter, it could transport, it was extremely versatile, as you would expect from German engineering. But as the missions went on, they were shot up every night, and every night they fought back. And if you look at it strategically, I don't know whether anybody here has read the book, Anthony Beevor's latest book on World War II. Even if you think you know a little bit about it, he has some new facts in there. It's amazing that the raids they did on Essen, because the Krupp, or Krupp, however you want to pronounce it, that family had been in Essen making war machines for 400, 500 years. And they were the company that was building the turret for the new Tiger tank to accommodate the modified 88 millimeter gun. So it was quite an engineering feat. Well, by consistently bombing Essen in late 42 and early 43, you hold up the production engineering and the design and the manufacture of these Tiger tanks. And what Anthony Beevor points out, and we don't know the answer to this because we never really had a chance to see it happen, but if you look in early 1943 after the failure at Stalingrad, there was the Kursk salient that the Russians had created when they stopped in February and March of 1943. At that time, the Russian army in that sector was very exhausted. They had outrun their supply lines, they had outrun their ammunition, and if, after the spring thaw, Germany had had the Tiger tank and the Panther tank, and they had run the same pincer movement that they did with Model and Manstein and Hoth, and the Russians had not had the time from March until July 5th that they did have to build up the 7 layers of defense, it might have been a major defeat on the Russian army. And in fact, it's even contemplated they could have destroyed 1/4 of the Russian army. Hitler delayed Operation Citadel until he had the Tiger tank, until he had the Panther tank. So months of preparation the Russians had because Bomber Command was bombing the factories that were trying to build the Tiger tank. And what's amazing about it is the Tiger tank, when it was first pressed into service in Prokhorovka, in the Kursk salient, it was literally only a prototype. It was far from being a real usable tank. That really didn't happen until April of 1944. So who knows how many lives were saved because Bomber Command managed to bomb Essen and slow down the production of the Tiger tank. Now here's a moral dilemma for you. If you've dropped a load of bombs and you're flying back at night out of Germany and you see a train, and all of a sudden you swing into the train and your tail gunner strafes the entire train as it's going along. If that train is full of soldiers, well, that's a good thing because that's what you're paid for. It's war. If that train is full of civilians, it can actually be a war crime. But it's night, so how do you know? And the only thing you can boil it down to is, well, I guess if you won the war, it's your call. And so it was a train full of soldiers. And that's the end of the story. Rommel was a brilliant general, and he was causing England fits. And when he was in North Africa, a large amount of the ammunition, the bullets that you see here, was diverted to Harold Alexander in North Africa to keep Rommel at bay. What that meant was the ammunition made by the English that Dad loved was in short supply, and so they actually had factories start up in the U.S. to build bullets and then ship them over to England. Well, as we all know, at the start of the war, the U.S. didn't have 100,000 people in their army, and the factories were not up to speed, and so the bullets that Dad used that came from the United States were not very good quality, And 3 times during that first tour, his guns jammed because of the poor quality U.S. bullets that were brought over. The Wellington is a very robust bomber. A geodesic design, you can almost guarantee that it can be shot up and fly back. The 3rd time that they crashed as a result of enemy fire was the worst, in that was the first time that the aircraft broke in half. So when they found Dad, the back part of the bomber had broken away with the tail turret still intact. The force had pushed it forward underneath the port engine upside down. That's where they found him. That was a pretty bad crash to have. And they were supported by fantastic ground crews. All Dad really had to do was harmonize his guns to 400 yards and belt his own ammunition. And at that time, he was using 1 tracer for every 6 bullets and not 5. He had developed a trigger finger because of the shortage of ammunition. He said that he was so confident in his hand-eye control that he could fire quarter-second bursts at enemy fighters just to control the ammunition. And if he did become as good as he thought he became in terms of accuracy later in the first tour, then male bumblebees in mating season had every reason to be afraid of my father. Duty carried out. Duty carried out. Duty carried out. Paddy will never turn back. Paddy will always get the crew back after the bombs are dropped. Has anybody here seen a movie called Target for Tonight? Made in 1941. What a fantastic movie. It's about a Wellington, and it's about a squadron in the early days of the war. One of the things you'll notice if you watch it again is when they list the names of the pilots and their crew, you're going to see a pilot named Cookson in that movie. And that was 1941, and Cookson was such a good pilot that he became squadron leader Cookson. He was the lead of 166 Squadron. And one night, when Dad and the crew were stood down from operations, Squadron Leader Cookson came to see Paddy and said, "My navigator's taken sick. Jimmy Clark, your Jimmy Clark is the best navigator in the squadron, in the group, in the flight. I'd like Jimmy to fly with me tonight. I'd like you to go and ask Jimmy, or tell Jimmy that he's flying with me." And Paddy, who was very superstitious, they flew Wellingtons even though Lancasters were available. It was inconceivable to Paddy to switch aircraft in the middle of a tour. Could not do it. So they would actually leave 15 to 20 minutes ahead of the Lancasters when they came in, just to allow the Lancasters time to catch up. Paddy said, "I am not asking Jimmy Clark to fly with you. You're the squadron leader. If you want him, go ask him. I'm not going to do it." So Squadron Leader Cookson went to see Jimmy Clark, the best navigator in the RAF as far as Dad was concerned, handsome Jimmy there, and said, "Jimmy, fly with me. You'll be with me in my plane, in my bomber." And so Jimmy said yes. This was after 28 operations, all duty carried out. They took off. They encountered night fighters over Belgium. They were shot down. Squadron Leader Cookson died in the crash, and Jimmy Clark died in the crash. Jimmy Clark died in a Wellington. He was 21 years old. The rest of the crew thought that they had lost a brother. Jimmy's mother had sent 5 rabbit's feet over so the crew could carry them. All the crew carried the rabbit's feet that was given by Jimmy's mother. And Jimmy was the one who died in action. 21 years old. He fulfilled the airman's creed. "I know that I will meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those I fight I do not hate. Those I guard I do not love." They finished the tour. The navigator used was an Australian flying officer, and Dad really can't even remember his name. They should have celebrated when they completed their first tour. They found it very difficult to do so because Jimmy had been killed. Everything perfect, every mission, duty carried out. They beat the odds. At the start, you had a 24% chance of completing a tour, and they did it. Not only did they do it, they did it brilliantly. So after the tour, Willie, the bomb aimer, he took his chanter and he went home. His duty was done. There was nothing else for him to prove. For me to tell you what Peter did after the tour, I have to take you back to the middle of the tour, because after their second crash, everybody spent about a week in the hospital, and then they were given leave. So Dad, when he was given leave actually Dad didn't think he was in a hospital because he had something hooked up to his arm and it made him feel good. That's all he knew. But after everybody left the hospital, Dad used his leave to go to the West End of London, which is one of his favorite places on earth. Peter used his leave in the middle of the tour after the second crash to go home and see his wife Rose and their 2 young daughters. So when Peter was home on leave, Peter must have built up a lot of angst over that second crash, and Rose was really glad to see Peter, and one thing led to another, and the next thing you know, Peter's back on operations, and he gets a letter from home saying Rose is going to have their 3rd child. So after the tour is completed, Peter now knows he's going to be a father for the 3rd time, so there's nothing more for him to do. So he goes back to Rose, and they welcome a little boy into the world after 2 daughters, and the little boy is christened Warren Murdoch, Murdoch with an H. Jimmy was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal, obviously for everything that he had done during the tour. And if you look at, if you read Anthony Beevor's book on World War II, it's instructive in comparing the Luftwaffe against the RAF. For a lot of good reasons. If you were an established or a good pilot or a gunner or anything in the Luftwaffe, your reward was continuing to fight. You essentially fought until you died. Now, this became a problem because later in the war, the quality of the pilots in the Luftwaffe dropped considerably due to 2 reasons. Number one, they didn't have enough fuel to take them up for enough hours to get the hours that they needed to become good pilots. And number 2 is the trainers were just normal trainers. They weren't the best who had learned through the School of Hard Knocks up in the air. Well, the RAF was different. If you were the best of the best and you did finish a tour, you were sent to instruct the new folks coming along. So this made it a no-brainer. Paddy immediately was decorated with the Distinguished Flying Medal, and he was immediately sent down to southern England to train pilots. The best pilot in the RAF, that's what you do with them. You send them down to train other pilots. Well, Dad went to see the King for a little while, had a nice chat, and then Dad was sent north to instruct air gunnery to 2 Polish squadrons. And that became a life-changing part of Dad's life. The kids, and they were kids, that had escaped Poland, had lost their families, they lost their houses, they lost villages. They came, they had nothing over in England. They had seen the Einsatzgruppen and the Einsatzkommando come in and wipe out entire villages. They had seen the Shoah by bullets, and they were seeing the Shoah by gas. 1 out of every 5 people living in Poland died in World War II. They suffered unspeakable atrocities. The first death camp was there, as was the second, as was the third, as was the fourth in Poland. Dad heard these stories early on. He heard them long before they became common knowledge, long before the Russians liberated the camps, long before the Americans found out about them. And he developed a deep love and appreciation for the Polish people that never left him his entire life. All these kids wanted, and they told him, all we want you to do is to teach us how to kill Germans in the air and teach us how to protect our crews in the air so that we can kill Germans by bombing them on the ground. Teach us to kill them. So, Dad taught them. And by all accounts, he taught them very well because he followed their progress. In the 12 months, he taught over 100 of them. And he followed them as they went on and fought. And they did very, very well. How many lives did that save because of that level of instruction? Not only did he think he did very well, but the Polish Air Force thought he did as well. The Polish Air Force, like the Polish government, was a government and an Air Force in exile in England at the time. And Dad was asked to come for a visit, and he met the commander-in-chief, and he was dressed with the Iron Eagle of the Polish Air Force. And so if you look, this is all the special. Over here, that's it, that's hanging there. That's being an honorary air gunner in the Polish Air Force. So, of course, you don't get 2 checks. You only get 1 check, which is from the Royal Air Force, but that was a distinction that Dad thought very highly of for the rest of his life. Paddy was down south. Dad was up north. November 10th, 1943, Dad received a telegram. The training base where Paddy was instructing the young pilots, there was a saboteur on base. And Paddy was using Wellingtons, and he had taken 2 young pilots up with him. Before the flight had taken off, the saboteur had taken a wax-like substance and put it in the gas tank. The Wellington bomber, with Paddy flying and the 2 young kids who wanted to follow in his footsteps, got to about 600 feet in the air, and then dropped straight down. Patty and the two young pilots were killed immediately. They couldn't kill Patty face to face. You couldn't do it. So they had to stab him in the back. The best pilot in the Royal Air Force. Dad was devastated and immediately tried to find out what he could do. And when they read Patty's will, it said, "If I am killed in action and Warren Ellis is still alive, I ask Warren Ellis to please take my ashes and take them back to Cork and present them to my family." So Dad had never been so honored in his life. So in a little airfield in Wales, which was close enough to cross the Irish Sea, because Patty was a decorated war hero, they set this all up. They arranged for a Sterling bomber. They arranged for a pilot. Dad came. He was presented with the ashes. He went to get on board to sit in the plane. And the person at the airport said, "Well, I'm sorry, although Ireland is not a belligerent in this war, Ireland has been bombed by the Luftwaffe," which is true, and there have been sightings of German planes over the Irish Sea, and so we're required for this plane to take off. I'm sorry, Flight Lieutenant Ellis, but we're going to have to find a tail gunner. And Dad said, "I think I can find you one." So Dad sat in the tail turret of the Sterling bomber. He had Patty's ashes between his feet and flew over the Irish Sea. He was not attacked by a night fighter. In fact, there were no German planes in the sky. And as I think about it, it's almost a good thing, because I would feel very sorry for the German fighter pilot who tried to stop Dad from taking Patty's ashes back to his family. So he delivered the ashes. His family said, "Thank you for bringing our hero home." The best pilot in the Royal Air Force, gone. The aftermath, the best of the best. Perfect record. All duty carried out, and yet 2 of the 5 in the crew did not live to see the end of the war. That's like taking a gun with 5 chambers, putting 2 bullets in it, spinning it, and then pointing it to your head and pulling the trigger and hoping for the best. Those were the odds they faced, and yet those were better odds than many faced in Bomber Command. And that's why Dad always said, you won't see a decorated war hero. You only see decorated survivors. The heroes are over there. They stayed there. They didn't come back. So Dad went on leave, went back to his house in Rothesay at the end of Maiden Lane, talked with his parents, sat on the deck, and all of a sudden he realized it's very, very quiet here. Patty's dead. Jimmy's dead. I know the Poles are still suffering. There must be something else I can do. So the first thing he did, crazy as it sounds, was he went back and signed up for a second tour of operations. It took a little while to get used to, because the 20 operations he flew this time were on a Halifax bomber. And the tail turret of a Halifax bomber is a Bolt and Paul tail turret, as opposed to a Fraser Nash that was in the Wellington. The Fraser Nash is run almost as if you have motorcycle handlebars. The Bolt and Paul is more of a joystick. So it took Dad a little bit of time to get familiar with the tail turret. But once that was done, they were off bombing Germany again. Only this time it was different. The flak was still there. In fact, the flak was still intense. But the Luftwaffe, the fearsome Luftwaffe that had just scared them silly in late 42 and early 43, just wasn't there. And in a cryptic way, it was almost sad that they weren't there. And the pilots that Dad did see, as I said, they were so poorly trained. Dad found that minimal evasive action instruction managed to clear them out of any trouble, and then the fighters never found them again. So it was almost sad. But what Dad did have a chance to see was the Russian front, because literally with the thousands of Stalin's organs and the tanks and the like, you could literally see the front close in on Berlin. After that tour of 20 operations, Dad came back to Rothesay, sat on the deck, said it's too quiet, and there was still one theater of war going on, and on May 8th, it was considered that the war in the Pacific was going to go on for a number more months. And it was also expected to be very tough fighting, because it was known that the Japanese would defend their homeland to the death. So the Royal Air Force, traditionally the Avro York is a carrier plane. It was used to freight VIPs around, but the Royal Air Force ordered 208 military versions of the Avro York, and that was going to be used as the bomber that Dad was going to fight in. Thanks to Harry Truman, and I mean a big thanks to Harry Truman, he finished his training, but he never had a chance to take on any Japanese Zeros, which is a very good thing. because then he found out that there's a reason why Japanese Zero pilots don't carry parachutes with them. And if they can't shoot you down, they will ram the bomber. And I didn't want Dad to go out with his last words being, well, isn't that interesting, as the bomber's heading toward him. Dad ran out of theaters to fight in. And I go back to our youngest son, Tyler, when he was 5 years old, and we were at the cenotaph. And we were leaving, this is in Rothesay, and Tyler asked a question, which was, Dad, why is it that when we're leaving and the ceremony is finished, that you take your poppy off and you go up to the cenotaph and you put it on the cenotaph and you say, thank you, Patty, thank you, Jimmy. Why do you do that, Dad? And I told him, and now I've told you. Now you know a little bit about the story, 10% of it. There's all kinds of things I'll probably never tell anybody. But I would like to finish up just telling you a couple of things about Dad. For those of you who know Adolf Galland, he was shot 104 Allied planes down. He was shot down 4 times himself. And at the RCAF reunion in 1988 in Winnipeg, he was the keynote speaker. And a lot of the surviving air crew with Bomber Command wouldn't shake his hand, didn't like him, didn't want him there. And Dad decided that despite all that, he went up, shook Adolf's hand. They had a great chat about being shot down and everything. And just, I guess you can try and kill somebody for a few years, and then as years go by, you can actually go up and shake their hand. We don't have any tail gunners today. The position doesn't exist. It's a shame. It's a lost art. Has anybody here seen the movie Memphis Belle? Yes? Did you like it? Yeah, that's it exactly. I'm glad you said that. Dad hated it because it symbolized everything that he didn't like about that American bravado. And so you're in the air and you're screaming at the guy while you're firing the machine guns, and Dad said, that just didn't happen with us. He said, we were very professional all the way along. You might hear a few words, but Target for Tonight is the movie that you want to watch if you want to realize how professional an air crew can be. And they even had key little things that they would say over the radio to each other just to calm each other's nerves every time a shell exploded and the aircraft shuddered. So one would go off and all of a sudden Willie would say, shh, you'll wake the baby. Or Peter would say, don't mind my skinny legs, or anything crazy just to take the stress off. And Dad saw something in April 1943, and at the end of it, he figured it was an ME-262, and he went back and traced it, because it wasn't the Heinkel 162, 178, or 280. But at the time, the ME-262 had its maiden flight on the 18th of July, 1942. In fact, 9 months ahead of the Gloucester Meteor. And between then and 1944, when it went into full operational service, they did do a series of test runs. So it's entirely possible that this thing that Dad saw streaking across the sky, when no one really knew about a jet engine and how fast it can go, was an ME-262. And at that time, guess who was test piloting them? Adolf Galland. So it's entirely possible that they didn't quite see each other, but they kind of passed in the night. And all Dad knew was at the end of every mission, after the debrief, you were allowed to go over to a cask of rum, and you were allowed 1 ration of rum. Dad found out that if you come back and you tell during the debrief that you've seen something go twice as fast as anything with propellers, you get 2 rations of rum, and then sent away. We have freedom here. We have the freedom to choose. And if I could end just using this as a bully pulpit, imagine a totalitarian state where you are required by law to have a book called Mein Kampf in your house. And if the Gestapo enter your house, which they can, because the state has more rights than your individual rights, and they find that you don't have it on public display, they can take you away and try you and sentence you to whatever they want to sentence you to, because you don't have any rights. The state is more popular than the individual. And imagine being in Russia where you have to have a picture of Joseph Stalin on your wall. And if Beria's NKVD come in and they don't see that picture, they can take you away as well. And they can do whatever they want to you because they can. Because the rights of the people trump the rights of the individual. We here in Canada, we can do whatever we want. We can choose to vote or we can choose not to vote. We can choose to go to the cenotaph on Tuesday or we can choose not to. I have a sneaking suspicion I know what this group's going to do. We can choose to worship what we want, or we can choose not to worship at all. And we can have whatever books and pictures we want in our house, and no one can come into our house without our consent or without a warrant. We have this thing, it's called freedom. And it's where individual rights trump the rights of the state, and individual rights trump the rights of a collective group of people. But that freedom comes with a price. Who paid that price? I know who did it, and I hope you knew when you came here, and I hope at the end of today you know some of the names of the people who made that ultimate price. Because even if today, even if one or two people leave with a little bit more of an understanding about the real reason why we have our freedom, the price that we have to pay for the right to choose, and it's because the real heroes, it's because the Paddy Coughlins and the Jimmy Clarks went to fight for us and died for us. If anybody understands that at least a little bit better, I'll be able to look at my dad and say, Dad, duty carried out, duty carried out. Bomber Command was the second front. Stalin always wanted a landing on the Atlantic coast in 42. That couldn't be done. Bomber Command was the second front. And I'd like to end by reading a short little letter to Bomber Command, to those who served. And I think, I'm going to tell you who wrote it, but I think partway through you're going to guess who wrote it anyway. To Bomber Command, to those who served. All your operations were planned with great care and skill. They were executed in the face of desperate opposition and appalling hazards. They made a decisive contribution to Germany's final defeat. The conduct of the operations demonstrated the fiery, gallant spirit which animated your air crews and the high sense of duty of all ranks under your command. I believe that the massive achievements of Bomber Command will long be remembered as an example of duty nobly done. Signed, Winston Churchill. Thank you all for coming.
Well, I think you heard a good speaker today. I do know that there are even a few stories that Tim hasn't told yet. I've heard some of them too, so maybe another time. But again, I'd like to thank you, Tim, for your talk. Oh,
Tim, don't go away.
Okay.
1%.
Oh. Maybe you'll find the in there.
Thank you.
I got one word for you, Tim, before
Yes.
conclusion. Yes, you put a name in there because we got another hit for.
Boyd Trice. No. Have you ever had that? I've had that happen.
No, I haven't had that. I've never won anything in my life. So.
Elsa Stanley.
Thank you very much for coming.
Now, Tim, would you be willing to answer some questions if people like to?
Well, I'll try. Yeah.
Okay. Have any
I need
questions
a
for
little
Tim?
drink of water to get my throat on.
Tim, I have one question.
Yes.
I think I heard when you spoke one other time that your father's crew took part in the bombing of the heavy water plant in Norway.
No, they did not. They did not bomb anything in Telemark or.
Okay, no.
No.
Yes,
They were for the first tour. They were primarily the Ruhr, Happy Valley. That was Jim.
Tim, thank you very much. Very touching. Just on an operational point of view, the Wellington, what kind of range did it have? How short of fuel were they getting back to base, so to speak? What kind of speed did they fly at? Was there a co-pilot seat, or was it just one pilot?
Yep. No, there was, and I guess geographically the best way to explain it is if you did the Ruhr River Valley and a little bit south of it and then came back, that was essentially your operational range. So I'm not sure how south Frankfurt is from Hamburg, but that was it. So it was
They're
a,
at the limit getting back.
yeah, and it flew at around 155 miles an hour. It was not a very fast, it was only 2 engines, so not a very fast.
It's also called the Wimpy.
Yes, yeah.
And co-pilot seat or just, no, not at all.
Yeah. No, actually, there was a co-pilot seat, and Patty took Mary's dad up. So the co-pilot seat was, the nickname was Dickie, riding Dickie, so you could sit in that seat.
But operations were normally across the board, one pilot.
That's correct. Yeah, one pilot, and the a twin-engine bomber, your range is not very good. So it wasn't. I mean, it's amazing strategically. If you look at Germany, they had the Heinkel bomber, which was a twin-engine bomber. So the reason why they have that is that in their war plans, they never imagined that they would have to bomb anything as far away as to require a 4-engine plane. So your strategy influences the type of aircraft and tanks that you have. So early on, it wasn't until the Halifax and the Lancasters came on board that you realized you needed a 4-engine, and also to carry a bigger bomb load. Because what they found with the 2 engines was to get you over there, you couldn't drop as much as what a 4-engine could carry.
Tim, is it Kirkton? Did you
Yes.
say? Where is it? Must be right down in the south, I guess.
Well, Carmington is northeast.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh,
Almost you have to get up through to Scotland. You're getting close up there. Yep, right on the Black Sea.
My brother was in Blenheim bombers.
Yes,
All of them.
they were.
He was a pilot, and it was daylight, and they were not in radio contact. 3 of them went, and none of them came back. And we never could discover it. I imagine they were shot down over the channel.
what year was that?
Yeah.
Very, very early in the war, my brother got his pilot's license when he was 17, in 5 years. So I don't know quite what happened. But those Blenheims were nasty.
The Blenheims and Stirlings suffered heavily early in the war, and the Ferry Battle was moved into just becoming a training aircraft. That's what Dad trained on when he was over in Europe, and they suffered tremendous losses. Yes.
Was your father less body member of the group?
As far as I know, yes, and it's simply because I mean Peter was 9 years older than Dad was, and I think Willie was a couple of years older. So and they didn't touch base. Actually, Dad was closer, stayed in contact more with the folks in the second crew than he did with Willie and Peter. They just went back to Scotland and they disappeared. But yeah, Dad was 91, so unless Peter made it to 100, although if anybody was going to make it to 100, it'd be Peter, but Dad would be the last of the crew.
As Tim mentioned earlier, that we lived side by side, so I had occasion to talk to Warren lots about different things, but I never knew of Warren's history. He never talked about it, never bragged about it. He did tell me, and it must have been 85, 86, the anniversary, we met Galvin.
88.
88. That's the first time that I knew that Warren had been in the Air Force. And Warren did talk about Galvin, and he was very impressed.
Yeah.
Yep. So,
Tim, you mentioned just very briefly, skimmed over Warren going into Buckingham Palace. Can you just tell us, I mean, that just was a quick mention.
Sure. Well, it's a funny little story, and to make it as quick as possible, it's I mean, what it is, you hear the king wants to see you. So when you're decorated, it can come, from various officers. Your dad was decorated by Harold Alexander, Field Marshal Harold Alexander. So it's decorations can come from anywhere and everywhere. And in this case, Dad was just asked to go to Buckingham Palace, and at that time, The investiture is a little different than what you see if you look at anybody awarded by the Governor General. In Canada, you see seats and rows and everybody stands up and you know that you're there. And that wasn't the case at Buckingham Palace. It was you wait outside, there's nobody really waiting with you, and then you go into a little anteroom. And the anteroom is just off on the side and it's shaped like an L. So you enter here and you can go down so far and then it goes off to the right so far. And when you go in, you're called in, and when Dad went in, the person greeting him was the Lord High Chamberlain. And the first thing that Dad noticed was the Lord High Chamberlain had the robes and had the staff and had everything. He looked like the Archbishop of Canterbury. Very, very intimidating. And this is in the first part of the L. And so Dad actually started to think, wow, I'm going to meet the Lord High Chamberlain, not thinking for a second who was at the back end of the L. So the Lord High Chamberlain just says a few words to you, and then he simply says, His Majesty will see you now. And everybody has been briefed. So the king will only ask questions that require a yes or no answer. That's what he does. What you have to do is you have to say, yes, Your Majesty, no, Your Majesty, even though for the last 4 years you've been trained to say yes, sir, no, sir. So Dad carried on down after being blown away by the Lord High Chamberlain, went to the end of the L, turned to the right, and then what he saw, as he said, my knees literally went out from under me. Nothing on earth could prepare him for what he saw. It was King George VI, and he had the Admiral of the Fleet outfit on. He had the sword, he had the hat, he had everything, gold, braids, everything all the way up. And there he was, and it was just him and the King of England. And he kind of found a way to get close to the king, and the king just asked a couple of questions. The first question he asked was, did you do all your operations from English soil? And Dad said, yes, sir, and then realized that he had said, yes, sir, and he said, yes, Your Majesty. And then there were two other questions that he asked, and then he was decorated, and your country and your people are proud of you. And then he left, and he was given 2 free tickets to have a drink on the king at the first tavern that he could find. And the first tavern that he could find was the Bag of Nails, which is up at the end of Buckingham Palace Road. So that's where he went, and the next time I'm in England, that's going to be a little place to stop and raise a glass. But that's the...
Still exists?
I believe so, even though a number of those pubs have closed over the years. Just, if I could, Adolf Galland told a story, and thanks to Ben Stiller, it's only 5% as funny as it should be. And when he was the keynote speaker, he actually had the RAF folks laughing because he said, when we were coming over on the Battle of Britain, we knew you had radar, and we knew that you could tell we were coming, and we could hear you talking. But he said, what surprised me was you didn't get the aircraft we were flying correct. So there's this pause in 1988. And he carries on by saying, we were all coming over, and we heard you talking, and we were flying ME-109s. And you knew we were coming, but you didn't know we were coming in 109s because I heard somebody said, here come the Fokkers now. Now, before the movie Meet the Fokkers, that was, nobody was ready for that, and it was hilarious. It brought the house down. Nowadays, it doesn't. So this is the best pilot that Germany produced, and he has the room in stitches. So.
Tim, one question on the DFM. Did the whole crew get it, or was just...
Yes, the whole crew got it. Yep. In the citation, you'll see the words at the bottom. The words, although it varied for each. The words exceptional fearlessness in the face of danger are in the citation for all 5. So.
The other thing you probably know, maybe some of the guests here don't know, the DFM and the DFC are the same medal. The only difference being is the DFC is for officers, and the DFM for non-officers.
Yeah. And they were 5 sergeants when they started the tour. So shortly after the tour, Dad became flight lieutenant, worked up to pilot officer and flight lieutenant, which is 1 level below squadron leader, had he carried on. But no, they did their stuff as sergeants, not knowing what the inside of the officers' mess looked like, and who are these officers that walk around that we have to salute, and they carry cigarette cases instead of just pulling a pack out. So no, they did their bit as sergeants. So DFMs. Well, thank you very much, folks.
Thanks again, Tim.
Thank you for the
Very
book.
much.
Very, very much. And my only hope is that some folks come up and get a chance to see.
I couldn't agree with you more. I had no idea it was a and you know it's wonderful to, well, first of all, you're an amazing speaker, but you are because Warren himself didn't believe, he kept it to himself. See, my dad, it was almost like, well, I keep thinking my dad maybe even suffered, had been post-stress traumatic syndrome because he had to keep talking about the war constantly, always told the stories over and over. And I think it was his way just to relieve